Evening. My name is David Feinberg. I'm a board member of Social Enterprise Chicago, and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat, our first virtual Fireside Chat. We are joined tonight by Andrea Sáenz, who our host and moderator, Marc will introduce more fully in just a moment. I'd like to introduce Marc. Marc is the board chair of Social Enterprise Chicago, a nationally recognized business nonprofit and tax attorney representing social enterprises and their stakeholders. He chaired Governor Pat Quinn's task force on social innovation, entrepreneurship, and enterprise, and currently serves as the vice chair of the Cook County Commission on Social Innovation. He's authored more than 36 books, including Social Enterprise, Empowering Mission-Driven Entrepreneurs, and the Mission-Driven Venture Business Solutions to the World's Most Vexing Social Problems. Marc is the president of Social Enterprise Chicago. Tonight, we invite you to pose questions into the Q&A, and when we move to that section of the webinar, we will call from some of those questions. So without further ado, Marc, please introduce our guests, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, David, and thanks to everyone who's joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. And Andrea, it's a special treat to spend some quality time with you. I know it's hard to get on your calendar, and we're grateful that you've made the time this evening. I'd like to begin by talking about you, if I may. The trajectory of your career as a public intellectual is nothing short of extraordinary. You came to these shores from Ecuador. You originally found a place within the social service sector working at a community-based nonprofit in Philadelphia, where you were engaged in adult education and workforce development. You then became the chief of staff to the chief executive officer of Chicago Public Schools. You became a policy advisor to the U.S. Department of Education. You then became the executive director of a national nonprofit, encouraging Latinos to become entrepreneurs and have successful professional careers. You then became the first deputy commissioner of the Chicago Public Library System, where you were spearheading the efforts to use libraries to improve community well-being. Then you became the chief operating officer of the Chicago Community Trust. Last I saw, the trust had something north of $4 billion in assets, although last year was a pretty good year for the market, so maybe the endowment's even a little better than that. And now, as of 2022, you became president and chief executive officer of the Chicago Community Trust. So I begin by asking you, as you kind of review your personal and professional journey, what stops along the way have been most meaningful to you, and why? You know, you've had just an illustrious career, and as of 2022, you've now reached the peak of the nonprofit community foundation. Just curious about how you view that looking through the rearview mirror.
I appreciate that question, Marc, and I appreciate your kind and generous introduction. It's really lovely to be here with you today, particularly since I can do so, hopefully as everybody else, in the comfort of my home on this horrible, rainy, cloudy, gray, miserable Chicago day. A couple of things jump out at me that I think are worth sharing. So, you know, in the way that you described my journey, having been born outside of the US, being an immigrant, growing up in an immigrant household, community, matters to me a lot, and has shaped the way that I see the world and this country and our communities and opportunities to make things better. So part of what I think is important to say is the things I learned in my home and with my family like, how important it is to help one another and to be there for people who are starting out or struggling has stuck with me forever. The second stop I will talk about that is more of a career stop is in Philly. I worked in North Philly at a community-based organization called Congreso de Latinos Unidos with a group of colleagues 25 years ago now who are still friends, with whom we sort of tried to do things that felt beyond our ability to do as a small community-based organization. We stretched together to try to get some big things done in the city of Philadelphia for folks in our community, and that was a really important part of my career trajectory because it feels like that moment really has equipped me to take on some of the other big challenges. I learned there the importance of collaboration across sectors, right? So the biggest things that we were able to do in the workforce services and adult education work that I was doing, one was be grateful that I was doing that work inside a social services agency so that the people and the families that I was working with and that my team was working with to develop skills and go into the labor force had support for all of the other things that come up when you are not very well resourced in your household and trying to make a big journey into the labor market. That was important. The second thing was the critical importance of private companies, employers that were hiring folks, that were planning the way that they brought people into their organizations in ways that either helped make that successful or not. And then the important role that the public sector played. And it was an early exposure to the way in which when you line up those different sectors and people from each of those sectors who were all focused on the same outcome, you can get a lot of really extraordinary things done. And then I'll say, coming to Chicago, all of the things I've been able to do in this city have depended so much on this incredibly strong and interconnected civic infrastructure that we cannot take for granted. It really is extraordinary and unique across the country. And so many of those early lessons about how public sector, private sector, nonprofit community leaders can come together to make things happen. It's happening here in Chicago every day.
Well, what's interesting to me about what you just said, among other things, is that fundamentally your focus is family and friends. So that accounts for your extraordinary empathy and the way you look at social problems in a humanistic way. We're all increasingly looking at measurable social impact, and funders are requiring that. That's all well and good and important. We have to make sure our dollars are invested in a way that are delivering on the promise. But you as a human being are looking at people as people. So as we move from talking specifically about you to the trust work, it's not at all surprising that the Trust North Star is really about growing household wealth for Black and brown families in disinvested communities, because that's where you came from. That's where your heart still is. So, you're looking at, and this is obviously clear within the Trust strategic plan, you're looking at increasing income, building assets, reducing debts for these families. And if we look at generational wealth, we're looking at home ownership. Well, what is more family than home ownership? And the capacity then to transmit wealth through generations so that kids, grandchildren will now have opportunities that their parents and grandparents may have been denied. So I'm particularly interested in a couple of programs at the Trust that are seeking to facilitate home ownership within that, within those groups. So I'll identify specifically connecting capital and community. And I'm interested there in understanding how you're addressing racial inequities at the core of housing, the housing ecosystem. And then in addition to that, but I think in a complementary fashion, I'm interested in how protecting and advancing innovative home ownership does in fact allow for more people to have home ownership now within their reach. So how does each of those work, and how are they working? Are they successful? And how do you know? And do they work together? Are they synergistic? Are they complementary? And what are the value proposition that attaches to each? Because I think that's kind of the core of what you're about as a person, and what the trust increasingly is identifying it as among its most important missions.
I'll zoom out a little bit first, because I think it's important to put it into context, right? When
Please.
the trust began to think about how we might make a real difference in Chicago, one that's measurable, right? So connecting the sort of outcome measures work, the more kind of academic number crunching economist work, to the work that's important to us as human beings, we said, the big difference, the big factor that's keeping so many communities in a place where they're not achieving, equitable health outcomes, education outcomes, where we see gun violence really ravaging communities, is this lack of access to wealth, and wealth not as a good in itself, but really as a means to health and well-being, right? The fact that if you have enough assets in your control, you can make long-term plans for your family, you can get through a crisis, et cetera. And then the home ownership work really becomes front and center, because we know that most Americans own the vast majority of their wealth, of their net assets, in their home. But we still have big disparities in Chicago, and really, frankly, all over the country, when it comes to racial and ethnic disparities, when it comes to home ownership. So how do we close that home ownership gap in order to help close the wealth gap, has really been the question that we've posed. And 3C, which is connecting community to capital, is a pilot initiative. And it's a really bold initiative, because what the premise of that initiative is, and it's a partnership with JPMorgan Chase and a few other funders, and part of a national network, is let's look at two communities. In this case, it's Garfield Park and Humboldt Park, where there are many vacant properties. And we know that vacant properties create the kind of blight and the kind of atmosphere that is just not safe, and not the kind of neighborhood you want to live in. So how do we flip that? How do we take those vacant properties and turn them into an asset? By working with developers, real estate developers, who can build low-income housing on those parcels of land. Our team is working to enable that capital flow to those developers, and work with potential homeowners, but make sure they are already residents of the neighborhood. So rather than bringing new people in to say, oh, look, cheap housing, come in and transform this neighborhood, the teams that we're working with, the community-based organizations, are doing outreach to folks in each of those neighborhoods to say, let's help you, support you on a path to homeownership. In order to do that, a couple things need to be true, right? There needs to be a stable source of income. So you start thinking about people's employment, and is there a sustainable path? And then you look at all the financing vehicles available to people. And so our team's been really creative and working really hard to create low income mortgage products with CDFIs, with community finance developing corporation, with community financing entities, and try to sort of matchmake between the homes and the people. And it really forces us all to think about not just an outcome that we can, put in a presentation on a spreadsheet, but really each family, right? What is it going to take for this family to believe that they're worthy of being homeowners, which is a big issue, We've worked with, media to help tell stories about people who move into homeownership. And then how do you create all of the education and all of the supports that make that possible? Because in the long run, it's a much more stable housing prospect to have a mortgage that's predictable over time versus being at the hands of a rental market that goes up and down.
Well,
And is it being successful? I didn't get to that. It's early days. So we're at the early days of the project. What I can say is from a process measure, are we implementing the things we said we'd implement? Yes, we are. And doing so, I would say to the team leading this work in such a creative way and such an empathetic, sort of real, authentic way, understanding the realities that people are living with as they try to make these big life changes.
yeah, well, good luck with that, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership on that front and so many others. If we're to grow household wealth equitably, which is what this is all about, it seems to me we need some additional ingredients. We need changes in practices. We need mind shifts, mind space shifts, mind share shifts. We also need transformative policy. And I know that the trust is funding grassroots organizations locally, as well as statewide advocacy organizations to make policy supportive of what you're trying to accomplish and what a lot of other people are trying to accomplish at the city level, the county level, and the state level. So my first question, I think some in our audience would be interested in this one as well. Not that they're not interested in everything we say. How do you select your grantees? And I will have a follow-up question.
I wish I could give you a very clear formula, right? Press these buttons, enter this data, and you're in. The teams, particularly when it comes to those working on policy advocacy, are looking at the big picture, right? They're saying, okay, we have a policy agenda that our internal team lays out and says, we see these opportunities at the local level, at the state level, and less so at the federal level, but every once in a while there's a federal opportunity that look to be real game changers when it comes to moving the needle to help our communities build wealth. And so often then seek out the coalitions, the community-based coalitions that have come together to advocate for those policy changes. And to, decide how to support those, it really is, is this coalition or nonprofit organization member of the coalition truly representing the perspective of the community that's most impacted by this work, right? Because that's where we feel like we can add value by supporting organizations and entities that are bringing authentic community voice to the policymaking table, because it's often missing. So for us, that's kind of the highest value. Is that, are they enabling that authentic community experience, authentic community voice to be at the table? And then, things like, what role are they playing in the coalition? Are they leading the charge? Are they really making a difference? What kind of capacity do they need, and what kind of capacity do they bring? So that's the grant decision making work. We're also in an interesting place because we are also a 501c3, unlike private foundations. Those that are familiar with regulations around private foundations' ability to get engaged in policy work, it's much more limited than for a 501c3 a nonprofit like ours. So we also then will sometimes engage ourselves in that advocacy work and have a process for deciding where and when we think our voice might make a difference.
Yeah, and I know you are, and I know you do that in a very careful and impactful way. So as to the grantees, whether at the local grassroots level or statewide advocacy organizations, here we get to another measurement of impact kind of question. What results can you point to? How do you, I know there are good people doing good things, trying hard, but obviously you're in a political environment which is not controllable. It's influenced, but not controlled. What kinds of results can you point to?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we're really proud of, we were part of the coalition and supported the coalition that won the expansion of the earned income credit at the state level. which involved growing the number of people who are eligible to receive that credit. And again, back to this kind of financial stability being a key factor in the well-being of communities. So expanding the earned income tax credit, including ITIN holders, so people who don't necessarily have Social Security numbers, but are working in their ability to receive that earned income credit, including workers that are over 65 who had been excluded in the past, and workers under 25 who had been excluded in the past. So that's a victory, and I would say that that's a good outcome for the work. An early victory also was the Predatory Loan Prevention Act. Payday lending is a real problem in low-income communities, as you know. People who don't feel like they have the stability to go into a bank and provide and get their services from a bank will often rely on payday lenders to get them through. And the rate in Illinois was 300% interest rate for those loans. So we were part of a coalition that got it capped at 36%. Not low, but not 300%. So that was another, real win, I would say, for this kind of work, trying to reduce the debt that people have to carry just to get through their regular lives. At the city level, we have engaged in some advocacy for, local ordinances. The Connected Communities Act was one that passed with some of our support, and really a lot of good work with partners at the Trust to prioritize equitable transit-oriented development. So to bring an equity lens to the kind of support that the city has for development around transit areas around the city.
Yes. Well,
Those are just some.
No, that's great. So continuing, the various instrumentalities that you deploy, you look at lifting up vulnerable people community by community. And I'm well familiar with the Community Desk Chicago, which was incubated at the Trust and recently launched as its own 501c3. And they have, I guess, three parts to their journey. One is pooling capital, second is building networks, and third is engaging investment and funding. I worked with the Community Desk Chicago folks in my capacity at the Cook County Commission on Social Innovation, which incubates actionable social policy recommendations for the county board. And the Community Desk Chicago was extraordinarily helpful to us at looking at community-owned vehicles, for example, and we're still making great progress on that front. But the Trust continues to support, in its own right, local organizations that generate investments in commercial and housing development, provides resources to small businesses, including social enterprises, and trains and connects residents to family-sustaining jobs, which is really what this is all about. So how do you think you're faring on that front in terms of looking not just at individuals, but looking at this on a community by community basis in your efforts there, which of course are targeted, but they're targeted within communities that themselves are targeted. And I'm curious to learn how you see that faring and what's in the Trust future in that department.
We are seeing so many promising initiatives. So, again, early days, we've been engaged in this work in this way for maybe 3-ish years now. And what we've seen are a few things. One, the approach that our team has taken to bringing capital to real estate development projects, for example. When we look at opportunities to bring grant dollars to a real estate development project in a community, we're looking for opportunities to help bring to life something that the community themselves has said is a really important amenity that they want in their neighborhood. right? So we look at things like quality of life plans, and is this consistent with a quality of life plan that has been developed by a broad, group of folks in this neighborhood? And does this bring an after school program, a cafe, a business, sometimes a health center, a business incubator, all of those kinds of things that end up going into those plans and frankly have a hard time because they are community led and community based organizations are trying to raise the capital, et cetera, getting off the ground. So often those community based organizations are looking at public resources, private resources, nonprofit, all of these ways. And we look for opportunities to bring resources to a project that helps unlock the others. And so far, for example, our initiative We Rise Together, which was meant to help bring back online economic development that had been stalled because of the pandemic, right? We have made grants to 30 real estate projects. Last I checked, 8 had already opened their doors, and this is within the last 2 years. So a really quick turnaround of investment. And what I've heard from people, so there's, did the project get launched is one measure of success.
Yeah.
And so far we're on track and we're doing well. The second way, though, we've brought interesting research tools to those projects and initiatives to try to understand what happens in a neighborhood when a big sports facility opens or a big, depending on what the initiative is. And through interviews with community members, we've been learning about how people feel about their neighborhood, because that's a really important part of making this kind of transformation. And then the second sort of innovative data tool that we've used is we have a partnership with MasterCard. And they've shared their data, transactions, credit card transactions happening in those neighborhoods. And of course, MasterCard is only one credit card. There are others happening, but directionally, we've been able to see upticks in transactions, number of transactions, and dollars spent in communities in the blocks surrounding those projects. So those are the ways that we're bringing data and different kinds of tools to understand what happens when you bring something like this online.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And when you talk about business incubation, making of resources available to businesses, real estate development, we're talking about the power of the marketplace. And when we talk about jobs, we're also talking about the power of the marketplace, because as we see commercial growth, we see greater employment. And we see greater contributions to the tax base. So there can be greater services to disinvested communities and others. So,
and tying it back to home ownership, those houses, that asset grows in value when it is in a neighborhood with all of those kinds of amenities, right? So it really is all interconnected.
And it's all catalytic. Each reinforces the other. And
yes.
So I think that's a key feature. So talking about the power of the marketplace, in your quest to attack concentrated poverty, how does the trust leverage its buying power to source goods and services from enterprising nonprofits, from social purpose businesses, from worker-owned cooperatives, essentially elevating its supply chain to a value chain? Is that on your radar? And how do you go about doing that?
I mean, I have to say the amount of, kind of discretionary spending that we do in the marketplace is relatively modest. But we have, over the last several years, created through kind of crowdsourcing through our networks, lists of businesses, locally owned businesses, businesses led by people of color, businesses in the communities that we are prioritizing for economic development, that provide a variety of goods and services. And we've tried to use those as our main, modest things, catering, event planning, photography, film production, those kinds of things, marketing. We have absolutely prioritized those local businesses in our own spending. Where we really have, I think, an opportunity to make a big impact, because as you said, our assets under management are relatively large, is in our investment manager relationships. So the trust actually many years ago prioritized investment managers of color as a way to think about how we make decisions about who manages our assets and our investments. And we continue to do so, and we continue to refine kind of how we think about that. Thinking about local folks, thinking about Black and Latino folks, thinking about folks in our market. And we probably, what I've learned is that something like 98% of assets under management in the market are managed by white men.
Yeah.
And something in the 20 to 25% of our assets are managed by women and people of color. And we keep pushing that number up, all the time. So that's where I feel like our buying power is the biggest, and can make a big difference. In addition to that, though, we have been involved with organizations that are trying to figure out how to get the large corporations with giant buying power for their legal services, their accounting services, to think about a local investment. And so we're really keen on trying to figure out how to do that, how to make that easy for companies to decide to do, and how to make it the norm in Chicago, because it just feels like, why would we be sending our big resources outside the city when there's so many talented people here who can be doing that work for us.
I agree with you. And, I'm seeing as public companies and private companies are revisiting their corporate social responsibility agendas, especially since COVID and the disparity that hit in minority communities, the racial reckoning, a greater recognition that climate change is real and an existential threat. Those businesses are no longer content to write a check to support a parade. They want to partner up with mission-driven businesses or nonprofits, and they're, in order to attract the greatest talents in the next generation coming up, those folks want to see that the culture is committed to driving social change. And even middle management wants to have opportunities to mentor nonprofits and social purpose businesses. So there is an alignment of interest, I think, that's driven by recent societal challenges.
Yes.
And I think that all works. One other thing I want to pass along to you, if you're not, and you may not be aware of it, but I will pass it along to you and to our audience. As we're talking about empowering social enterprises and businesses that have a mission attached to them, I did draft an ordinance that was unanimously approved by the Cook County Board that creates a procurement preference for social enterprises. And they get a 5% improvement on their bids if they want to sell goods or services to Cook County or any of its departments, divisions, or instrumentalities. So we're talking about the transportation system, public education, the ports, the jail, the courts, and so on. These are big buyers. So,
yes.
So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, because there may be ways you can enlighten the folks you're working with about those kinds of opportunities outside the trust, but where the trust can facilitate kind of education around how these businesses can be more self-sufficient, more self-reliant, more successful over time. So I throw in that little commercial for the Cook County Board's good work there.
We also love to shine a spotlight, for example, on Rush, University of Chicago, right, who have thought about their own spending and their responsibility to their neighboring communities. And I think that's a great example that many others can follow.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah. And they're being pushed, but they're also looking internally at how they can do more for all kinds of important reasons tied to their various constituencies and stakeholders. So, people do stuff because they see it as important morally from a business perspective, or because people who are important to them see it as important. And there are lots of reasons to do that, and all good. I don't question anybody's motives. If they're doing good stuff, let's applaud them and encourage more of it. When we talk about the trust community engagements, clearly the trust is being not only innovative, but disruptive. And in the social enterprise community, there's really no greater compliment than being disruptive. So I want to point out still another example, which is merely illustrative of the kinds of things that the trust gets involved in. And this is something where I have a particular personal and professional interest, and that is Press Forward Chicago, where the trust, in concert with the MacArthur Foundation and others, are helping solve the local news crisis. I happen to represent the News Guild, which is the unit of the Communication Workers of America that represents all the journalists nationally, 30,000 of them. And
Wow.
I've been engaged to help them design new business models, new entity structures, and new funding strategies. But what you're looking at and what I'm looking at is when you don't have, we can go over the history of this, but I think it's fairly well known these days. If you don't have local newspapers that are accountable to those communities, those folks don't know what's going on at City Hall. They don't know how to vote.
Right.
They don't know
That's
who's doing
exactly
right,
right.
who's doing wrong. So we have issues of disinformation, limited access of knowledge and information. It's a threat to democracy. You know, that's a topic unto itself that's fairly timely. And at the same time, I know you're looking at kind of inequities within the journalistic community, because there are plenty of those, and they are structural and they go back a long time. So I have two questions here. One is kind of a broader question, and that is when the trust is collaborating with other major philanthropies, how's that working as to this initiative or others? I mean, I would like to be a fly in the wall. Sometimes I am, but usually not. And how does that all work out? You have, big pocketbooks, maybe some big egos someplace, who knows? But people have their own ideas. And
Yeah.
how do you harmonize those? How do you reconcile that? How does it all work? And I'm not calling out MacArthur specifically, but the whole notion of large philanthropies coming together around a social problem. How do you navigate those waters?
That's a really good question. But, I would say the answer is the same as it is with any other organization to organization collaboration, right? You get further if you're clear about the objective and if the objective is compelling and important to both organizations. And when it comes to foundations, it has to include, are the boards aligned that this is an important thing to be doing? Are the teams then aligned with the how it gets done? And to me, it's sort of one of my favorite things about being in this work, building those collaborative relationships and getting multiple people,
Yeah.
aligned behind a big idea, and then working through the kinks and the details about how does it get done, and what do we do first, and what do we do second, and who gets included, and whose ideas, how do we evaluate the ideas, because there's no shortage of good ideas. I'll talk about Press Forward as an example, since you mentioned it. So one thing is, what's the big problem, right? The big problems are the ones you named, that a business model that allowed us to have pretty good, journalism and news is no longer working. All kinds of disruptions changed the model completely. What I think we all agree about is it's an opportunity not to shore up that old business model and try to go backwards to the good old days when, things were the way they were. And what got me excited about Press Forward, and the reason that we joined forces with MacArthur and with others, is because they agree this is an opportunity to create a new approach to news and information that is more inclusive. So that does bring in voices that had been excluded before, that brings in perspectives that had maybe not been part of the dialogue when you talked about big journalism. And so much of what you talked about, I've learned a lot from, thank God, Medill School of Journalism is just up the street here. They they've done all this research about what happens when there isn't a strong news ecosystem in a community. People stop voting, corruption goes up, all kinds of terrible things happen. So we're trying to protect this, institution of democracy, but we're trying to do it in a way that honors its past, but looks to a future that's going to be very different from that past. It has to be, right? It has to be more representative of different perspectives, different views, cultural views, those kinds of things. So Press Forward is that opportunity. And then the work really becomes, okay, lots of people have put resources into this, collaborative fund. How do we get them all around a table to get excited about a couple of different levers we can pull right now? How do we learn from those things together? Really leverage the partnership to do some evaluation, to do some thinking together, and then, take a few steps forward based on that shared understanding.
And where the effort is accountable to the community rather than ownership. That's
right.
And
That's
those are my marching orders from the union, because unlike lots of others who are incubating businesses, here it's not about building something for an entrepreneur, but really building something for the greater good and for the people who rely upon it. And that's, to me, that makes all the difference, because we have enough examples of hedge funds coming in, and you can fill in the gaps in that sentence. But where the community is the driver and the reason it's being done, that makes all the difference in the world. Because to the extent you are loyal and accountable to the communities, the result is going to be different. The outcome is going to be judged based upon what you've done for the community. And I think that's
so I don't know if we're going to land on a not-for-profit model being the right model, or a social enterprise that has some social accountability in addition to I don't know what it's going to be, but it can't be what it used to be.
There's no question. It's dead. So I have one more question, kind of a big question, but I think before I ask it, I should let the audience know that after Andrea answers that question, we may tackle a question or two. So if you have any questions, go to your Q&A button and tell us what you'd like to learn about and what you'd like to ask, and we'll do our best to field them. So having said that, let's open the aperture here. As we look to our region, and of course the trust is the city and I'll say its environs, we have a growing community of L3Cs, benefit corporations, enterprising nonprofits, worker-owned cooperatives. There's a fervent community of interest around the powerful idea of driving positive social change through market-based strategies. The social enterprise community depends on collaboration of socially conscious entrepreneurs, investors, philanthropists, educational institutions, foundations, traditional businesses, financial institutions, government. As my last question, and the audience may have some others, I'll ask you how we might think about collaboration. While we face enormous racial and ethnic wealth and income gaps that the trust obviously is very aggressively seeking to address, disparities in access to good health care and food and housing insecurity, what's the best way for us to think about aligning the interests of all the stakeholders who are necessary or desirable to give our mission-driven ventures everything they need to flourish?
Well, Mark, thanks for that very easy question.
For a reason I wouldn't have to
appreciate it. Yeah. I mean, I think what I want to focus on is the newness of that kind of thinking, right? The fact that this is sort of new territory, this idea that businesses, people, corporations, public sector actors can all act in concert with one another towards a set of shared goals. I don't know that we've ever quite achieved that. The intermix of those have often felt a bit adversarial, sort of one side or the other. I do think that this moment, whether it's the climate crisis that we were joking about before we jumped online, but that is real, or the kinds of things that you mentioned that we're facing as a society will allow us to sort of wake up and say, okay, I may not agree with everything about the way that your entity or institution is organized or what you're striving for, but we can agree on a couple fundamental things. And then we can each think about what role we play in moving together towards a future that's better in that regard. And like all, like all collaborations, it requires that I be very clear about my own goals and intentions, understand yours, understand your constraints and limitations, um, and then try to work honestly and openly towards solutions. I'll share one example. The gun violence issue in Chicago is one that we're all, you know, thinking about probably all the time, especially over these last couple of years where incidents of gun violence have gone up pretty steeply, not just in Chicago, but really all over the country. And there's no easy answer. And what we understand from research and evidence is that it's a kind of a stacked set of solutions that are going to get us out of this mess. There are some policy solutions. There's certainly economic solutions, jobs, engaging people in positive economic opportunity. There's some sort of clinical solutions, right? Many of the folks who have grown up in communities where there's high gun violence have grown up in traumatic environments, and they need care that addresses that trauma. There are, all kinds of different things that need to happen. And the Trust has been part of a collaboration for nearly 8 years now called the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities. And it was a foundation sort of philanthropy-led effort to put resources behind some evidence-based solutions to combat gun violence across the city. And now we have a business community through the civic committee's leadership who has said, we care about this issue, we want to join. This is an example of people just saying, what do I have to contribute to the solution? We have a sense of what the solution might be. We have jobs to offer. Great. We have, philanthropic resources to offer to help with research and with understanding. We have government resources that can help provide services. And that's an example of, it's not perfect. It's not, easy, a way that we're beginning to come together around a shared goal, which is to reduce gun violence, to make Chicago the safest city in the country, safest big city in the country, I'll say. So that's just an example of how I think we can begin to work differently in Chicago. And as I said, when I started, the strength of the civic fiber and the social fiber in the city is really unparalleled. And we really need to lean into that and take advantage of it to push ourselves into uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable relationships with people to work towards these kinds of shared goals.
I think you're exactly right, and you say that so eloquently, and I think what you're really saying is siloing doesn't work. You need to look at the other institution, organization, government units, and what is the value proposition, looking at it through their lens, that would drive them to collaborate with you. So it's,
Yes.
as with any negotiation, you're looking at what does the other guy need or wants, and how can you offer that such that it advances your agenda. And so that I thank you so much for that. And I think that's wonderful. So I think we do have time for a question or two. And I saw some pretty interesting ones. So let me start with this one. The question relates to the impact of the, and I'm quoting, horrible Supreme Court decision on the elimination of DEI on Chicago corporations, and how Chicago Community Trust can respond to this injury.
That is such a great question, and it's one that's on my mind actually quite a bit. I've had pretty candid conversations with corporate leaders about how they feel that Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, banning affirmative action at institutions of higher learning, has impacted their own DEI initiatives.
Yes.
And most of what I've heard, one-on-one, is it doesn't really change anything for us, right? We are still committed to the things that our lawyers are looking at the language we use. Our lawyers are making sure that we're not doing anything that's in violation of the law. We do not want to violate the law.
Right.
However, we don't see that change impacting our commitment to creating the kind of workplaces that bring people in that are underrepresented, that make the environment one where they can succeed. I've been encouraged by the Chicago business community's response. Now, is that true across the country? No. And is it also true that many of our Chicago business leaders are not at a corporate headquarters and are still reporting to someone maybe in a different state where their interpretation of that decision is not as optimistic? Yes. So we still have work to do. But what we're doing is we're raising the issue. We're raising the topic. I'm going to be at a actually National Community Foundations meeting next month, where we're bringing a couple people to talk with all of the community foundation leaders about what they're seeing nationally with corporate community and with philanthropic communities' response to the decision. But I've been encouraged by what I've heard. People are standing firm behind things like, the fact that DEI initiatives do lead to better business outcomes.
Absolutely.
We have enough of that evidence base that business leaders that I've talked to are standing firmly on.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Well, I have very much enjoyed our time together, Andrea. The hour has moved by too swiftly. And I'd like to thank you for your time with us and your expertise and your insights and your commitment and all you do every day. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. And David, I think in our remaining couple of minutes, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you. And thanks everybody for being with us. And until next time, and Andrea, I look forward to catching up with you one-on-one in the near term. And thanks again for doing this.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks everyone for being here.
Truly a pleasure.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Mark, and thank you for everyone for joining us on this foggy and rainy Chicago evening. What a delightful and formative conversation. We look forward to following up with you on future Social Enterprise Chicago Fireside Chats. Just as a quick reminder, we are a 501c3 social enterprise ourselves, funded primarily by private donations. So in the chat, you'll see a link to make a donation to Social Enterprise Chicago. Please consider a voluntary donation that is comfortable for you and meaningful for you. And we will deeply appreciate your support. And again, I'm sorry, Andrea can't see us all, but what a incredible conversation. Truly a Chicago treasured leader. So thank you again, and have a safe remainder of the evening.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.